Marlin's Opera House was built over a 3-year period, beginning in 1883. Colonel Silas Marlin was a Brookville man who was in the Civil War and was made a colonel in the 105th Regiment. He came back after the war and was thereafter forever known as Colonel Marlin. He was a lumberman, just like so many in the Brookville area who made their fortunes in lumber in those days. And in the mid-1880s, he purchased 2 city blocks on Main Street, across from what was then the American Hotel, and began the construction of the biggest privately owned building ever built in town. He began in 1883 and finished it in 1886. He demolished 4 or 5 undistinguished buildings, probably that dated from the 1840s, in order to build the Opera House. And over the 3-year period, the newspaper commented often on his progress. And at one point, it was noted that the progress had stopped because they ran out of bricks. And then eventually it started back up again. These, of course, were handmade bricks. And if you look at the size of this building, 120 feet long on Main Street and 3 stories high, it was a lot of brick to make. And at one point, the newspaper editorialized that the colonel had said that he was going to finish the Opera House that particular spring, and the newspaper editor quoted, "We hope so." The building is really a phenomenal piece of architecture. It was designed by a man from Du Bois who had also designed the Butler County Courthouse. In those days, of course, we didn't have schools of architecture turning out architects left and right, so most of the architects of the day were contractors who depended on pattern books and study to decide how to create their building. A newspaper article dated June 30, 1886, described the future layout of the Opera House as it neared completion. The hall is 62 feet wide by 90 feet long. The stage extends clear across the hall, 62 feet, and will be 18 feet deep at its narrowest point, and will afford ample room for handling 120 performers without interfering with the audience. There will be 2 dressing rooms at each side of the stage, and several others connected directly with it. The opening at the front of the stage will be 32 feet wide. The stage settings, scenery, etc. will be of the very best, and will give every point of advantage to performers. It is intended to place seats in the hall sufficient to seat 945 persons. These will be divided into the parquet, dress circle, and family circle, or the gallery. The lighting, heating, and ventilating of the hall are admirably arranged, with a view to making the audience comfortable, as well as for convenience in handling the same. Our town will have great reason to feel proud of the Opera House when Colonel Marlin gets it completed. So finally, the Opera House did open in October of 1886 and remained in existence and operation till about 1907. Colonel Marlin did not live long to enjoy his Opera House, which opened in 1886, because he died on March 23, 1889. His obituary noted that the early part of his life was spent in Indiana. He was well known to many of the old residents of town and was respected by all for his true, upright character. But his family took it over, and his son, S.J. Jr., was the manager of it. It operated sort of in fits and starts. There were a number of kinds of productions here. The first production here was the Mikado by Gilbert and Sullivan that was scheduled to take place, and then as it turned out, it didn't take place. The grand opening of the Opera House was heralded in the newspaper by a nearly full-page ad that started out "Grand Opening" with a big exclamation point, and after the failure of the Gilbert and Sullivan production to show here, the Sawtelle, S-A-W-T-L-E-L-L-E, the Sawtelle Opera Company opened, and it said, "We'll open at Marlin's new Opera House." And that was Monday, November 1st, 1886. On November 3, 1886, the local newspaper included a large piece about the opening of the Opera House entitled "Opening of Marlin's Opera House," and it went on to say, "On Monday evening last, Colonel S.J. Marlin's new Opera House was inaugurated by the production of Monte Cristo by the Sawtell Opera Company to a very large audience. The play is a most exciting one, abounding in thrilling positions, and was well performed by Mr. Sawtell's company. Without attempting any criticism, we will just say that all parts were well taken and each performed well his or her own part. On Tuesday evening, The Shaghawn was performed by the same company in an artistic manner in a moderately fair house, and on Wednesday evening they produced Mr. Partner. This company will occupy the Opera House the balance of the week, giving an extra change of bill each night. Over the years, high school graduations were held here. Traveling troops performed here. The Fisk Jubilee Singers from Fisk University, a historically black school in Nashville, performed here, and they still perform. And it's one of our hopes to perhaps one day get them back to Brookville 130 years or so later to perform here at the Marlin. And the Opera House is on the second and third floor, of course, of the Marlin block, which in one instance has resulted in its preservation because it wasn't easily accessible on the ground floor as many were, and so it didn't get broken up and converted into some other use over the years. The Opera House is of course all wood inside. It has 3 different sections, including a balcony. It's finished in board and batten, multicolored board and batten finish. The side walls are stenciled with multicolored stenciling. The Proscenium Arch is broad and open. It originally contained what's called an oleo curtain, which is different from the kind of curtain that opens from side to side. An oleo curtain rolls up. And actually we still have, at the back of the stage, we still have the metal tube that the oleo curtain wrapped around historically. The drop curtain is a magnificent piece of work and is beautiful beyond our powers of description. A heavy double curtain of dark cardinal velvet is looped back at either end of the stage in rich and natural folds by golden cords, exposing to view a very handsome curtain of white satin with golden border and fringe, which hangs in the most graceful folds. On the center of this curtain hangs, suspended by a heavy golden chain, a beautiful picture surrounded by a magnificent gilt frame. Directly under the folds of the velvet curtain, at each side, stands a large vase filled with the most beautiful flowers. It seated over 900 people, which is pretty amazing, but the seats were very close together, closer together and smaller than contemporary seats. And we have a couple that are left that we've identified and have placed on the floor in the position that they would have been originally, lining up with the original holes where they were tightened to the floor. Another interesting thing we found in terms of our bits and pieces of cleaning is the numbering of the aisles that is painted onto the floor are still visible. And so you can see row A, row B, row C, and etc. We can best describe the scenery in a word by saying it is really grand. The views are so varied that they will be suitable for the presentation of almost any kind of play. There are 8 distinct scenes in addition to the drop curtain, and each scene has appropriate wings and also a border at the top. They are a parlor scene, a fancy chamber, street scene, kitchen, wood, garden, mountain pass, and a scene of the sea, and each is just as beautiful and natural as a perfect picture can be. The whole is certainly a credit to the artist, W. W. Wise of Philadelphia, who executed them in such excellent taste. And these could all be changed for the variety of shows that were produced here. Unfortunately, those sets we found were eventually passed on to the Brookville Fairgrounds in the 1920s and were repainted for production at the Park Auditorium here in town. So we don't have the sets. What we do have, though, is all the staging for the wing and border up in the fly of the stage. The technical aspects of the Opera House include what is called a wing and border set design. It includes the ability to move sets in and out. And it's been described really as almost unique, which is an overused term, but almost unique in America. This may be the last original wing and border set in its original setting in America. There's a book called Coal and Culture, and it's subtitled The Role of the Opera House in Appalachia. And it was written by a theater professor from Ohio University named William Condy. And Dr. Condy stated in correspondence with me, and he studied all through Appalachia, which basically runs from Mississippi and Alabama clear to New York State. And he wrote to me that the Marlin is the most pristine and unaltered opera house in the entire region. So that takes in a pretty broad swath of America. Other technical things that we have remaining in the opera house backstage is the original gas works. The opera house was never electrified. It was lit by a series of chandeliers, in particular a fabulous original chandelier of 20-some lights in the dome of the opera house that is easily visible today. The footlights were all gas, and the gas works were a series of valves behind stage that were labeled house, foot, border, dome, like that, so that whoever is running the lights could know what he was doing back there. And there's also a peephole that the technician could look through to see into the house. A newspaper article from September 30, 1886 provides additional details of the interior setting. The hall will be lighted with gas supplies and by a gas machine similar to that in the M.E. Church, Hotel Longview, and other buildings in the town. Throughout the entire hall, there will be 140 burners. A 36-light chandelier hangs in the center of the hall. 25 burners will constitute footlights. There are 2 proscenium lights, and the remaining will be distributed throughout the hall. Heat will be furnished by furnaces in the cellar, from which the heat will be conveyed to the hall through pipes and registers. Cool air will also be conveyed into the hall in a similar way, and the impure air will be carried up through the opening above the large chandelier and from thence to the outside, thus furnishing splendid and healthful ventilation. An ample supply of water and a hose is conveniently located at the rear of the building so that a fire could be checked almost immediately and danger from the same avoided. Taken as a whole, this magnificent opera house is a model of beauty, convenience, and comfort, for the completion of which Colonel S.J. Marlin, the proprietor, should be accorded proper honor and credit. Over the next decade and a half, Marlin's Opera House hosted a wide variety of acts, including local performers, nationally known and internationally known acts. An article from December 5, 1886 reads, "The Brookville Orchestra has been at work for 2 months in the preparation of a 2-part concert and comedy, which will be given in Marlin's Opera House on Monday evening, December 9. Part 1 will open with an overture by the orchestra and a chorus by the company. Some of these acts, among others, include the Fast Mail, which included a complete freight train of 14 cars and a Niagara Falls scene by moonlight. The rural comedy Old Hickory Farm by H. Eugene Phillips. The Bohemian Girl by the Andrews Opera Company. Trovatore by the International Grand Operatic Company. The African Boys of J.H. Balmer. And Josiah Simpkins, a pastoral comedy by the Josiah Simpkins Company." This was a time period in which the first motion pictures were being shown. Lyman H. Howe's exhibition of motion pictures were shown at least 2 occasions at Marlin's Opera House. The first was on April 19, 1900. A second screening took place on May 11, 1901. Some of the films included Early English Traffic, a London street scene; the arrival and reception of Lord Roberts at Cape Town, South Africa. Lord Roberts gets into his carriage. He had arrived to take over command of the British forces. Filmed January 10, 1900. The Rosslyn Castle, a troop ship, leaving for South Africa. Spectators on the quayside at Southampton wave farewell as the crowded troop ship Rosslyn Castle moves away to the right of the picture. Large numbers of troops on board wave back. This was filmed October 20, 1899. The Opera House ran pretty steadily until about the turn of the century, and then it kind of operated in fits and starts. On October 31, 1901, the newspaper reported, "We have been informed that Marlin's Opera House is permanently closed and will not be opened again as a place of amusement and entertainment." Despite this notice of closure of the Opera House in 1901, the last documented performance that we know about was in 1907, and it was more of a community type civic organization that met here rather than a play. In the 1920s, in 1922, the building was sold to 5 investors, 3 of whom were tenants in the building, and so the building went from 1 ownership to 5 ownerships, and over the next 60 or more years, the building changed hands as people died and people married, and there were descendants. And in the 1980s, when Reg McCabe, who was a pharmacist in the building, when he bought the building, it took more than 50 deeds to tie it up into 1 ownership. So that was quite a feat unto itself. The building sat pretty vacant. There was an interesting story in the 1920s. In the wintertime, the newspaper recorded that a half a dozen or so community business leaders hung a rug from the stage and hit golf balls into it. And that was in the 1920s. And then really nothing much happened to it until Reg McCabe bought it, and the first thing that he did was to solidify and stabilize the roof, which was critical because it's a huge roof. And the first time I saw the Opera House in the 1970s, there were buckets, 5-gallon buckets everywhere to catch the water runoff. In 2012, what we might describe as the new era of the Opera House began. Historic Brookville Incorporated is a community-wide nonprofit organization, and they sponsored a production, a live stage production of a play called Jacob Marley's Christmas Carol. That's a takeoff on the Dickens production. It was directed by Christy Taylor, who is a theater professional, and starred her husband, Chris Taylor, who is also a theater professional. We were able to seat 100 people here for that production, and interestingly, the town fire marshal was our first usher, and he assisted and supported the opening of the Opera House. Since that time, a number of productions have been held, musical productions as well as drama. We continue to give tours of the Opera House because it's such a totally unique setting. And our hope in Brookville is to someday be able to restore it and open it for full-time, or at least close to full-time production.